I'm really excited to be here participating in the History Book Club, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion after my sort of abbreviated sort of talk on the book. So as you know, I'm going to be talking about my book that came out in 2018, Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic Worlds. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the title, because I often get questions about, what exactly I mean by Christian slavery. And I've found that a lot of people sort of project onto the title what they think it means. But of course, we're probably all familiar with the important role that Christians, Black and white, played in the abolitionist movement to end slavery. And I think that to most people, many people who look at the title, they say, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. Christianity and slavery seem naturally opposed. But when we look at the history of early America, and really the entire history of Christianity and slavery, the picture is, of course, much more complicated. And so my book and my research are looking at that sort of more difficult history and relationship between Christianity and slavery. So I'm looking at how European Christians tried to reconcile slavery with their religious convictions, and specifically how Christianity also played a role in creating slave law in early America. And I want to sort of get into my research by telling a more personal story. So some people ask me, why did you spend over a decade of your life examining Christianity and slavery? So I think that telling a more personal introduction to the research helps to answer that question, and also provide some insight into exactly kind of what questions I was trying to answer as this project came into being. So, and the background here is that I, did not set out to write a history of Christian slavery. Instead, my objective was actually to write about the origins of anti-slavery and the abolitionist movements. So I began the research for what became this book, Christian Slavery, about 15 years ago. And it started with this document. So this is a copy of the 1688 Quaker anti-slavery protest, which was the first document in North America to denounce slavery. So Quakers, as I think probably everyone here knows, but just a quick reminder, small Protestant denomination that are probably best known for their peace testimony and for the important role that they played in the abolitionist movements. And so I was excited to write and read about this 1688 anti-slavery protest, because I had a personal connection to it as well. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I went to a Quaker school that is just blocks away from where this anti-slavery protest was written. And as it turns out, I had passed the site of its creation hundreds of times. It was on the way from my house to where I went to school. And I'd also been taught in school about the Quaker role in the abolitionist movements, and how important Quakers were to leading the movement to end slavery. So in short, I thought this was something really interesting. I would be able to learn a lot from it, and it was something that I could be proud of. And indeed, the 1688 protest is really an extraordinary document. So just to give you a little sense of it, declares, among other things, that the authors are, quote, against the traffic of men body, continues to say that slavery cannot be a Christian practice, that it's against the golden rule. And here are a few lines from it that give you a sense. There is a saying that we shall do to all men like as we will be done ourselves, making no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are. And those who steal or rob men, and those who buy or purchase them, are they not all alike? Here is liberty of conscience. Here ought to be likewise liberty of the body. So for the 17th century, this is a pretty incredible and unusual document. And it is a great document in many ways. I was excited to write about it. And at the time, I thought that examining the origins of abolition would show us not only that abolition has a history, but also how we could learn about social justice by studying the past. As I looked closer at the protest, however, I started to become less interested in the petition itself, and more interested in the very last line. And it was a line that was added not by the authors of the protest, but by the Quakers who represented the Abington Monthly Meeting and the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. So here is a close-up. "We have inspected ye matter above mentioned and considered of it. We find it so weighty that we think it is not expedient for us to meddle with it here." Below that, there's another line. "A paper being here presented by some German friends concerning the lawfulness and unlawfulness of buying and keeping Negroes, it was adjudged not to be so proper for this meeting to give a positive judgment in this case, it having so general a relation to many other parts, and therefore at present they forbear it." So slightly convoluted language, but the simplified version of it is that they rejected the protest. So these are Quakers rejecting the anti-slavery protest. So I'd intended to study anti-slavery, but I decided that this was more important, because what it revealed was that while a very small minority of Quakers rejected slavery in the 17th century, most did not. And moreover, despite the fact that I'd gone to Quaker school my entire life, I'd had no idea up to that point that Quakers were also enslavers. I also had more questions. What did it mean that slavery had, quote, so general a relation to many other parts? What other parts were they talking about? To answer this question, I had to dig deeper into the 17th century. And so, I was surprised to learn as I did this research, how accepted and common slavery was, not just among Europeans, which I already knew, but specifically among Quakers. Quakers were also involved in the slave trade. And as it turns out, many of the Quakers in Philadelphia, whose history I had learned growing up, had immigrated not from England, but from the Caribbean islands of Barbados. So Barbados may have been, and I think we have an image of a map coming up. It takes a while to load sometimes. There we go. Pennsylvania may have been the first official Quaker colony, but it was not the first Quaker community in the Americas. There was a large Quaker presence on Barbados where thousands of Friends lived. And in the 1670s, it was actually called the Nursery of Truth because it was so filled with Quakers. So when Pennsylvania was founded in 1682, William Penn, the founder, as well as other Quakers, used their connections in Barbados to purchase enslaved Africans. And as Pennsylvania's social and economic structure developed, ties with the West Indies and other trade outlets flourished. So the trade with Barbados was a source of pride and a symbol of prosperity for many of the English Quakers who considered slavery to be necessary for economic development. So I decided I needed to tell this story. Like many stories that are somewhat shameful or embarrassing, this one had been really suppressed in the Quaker histories that I read. Most scholarship about Quakers and slavery in the 17th century, even when it acknowledged that Quakers did own enslaved people, it still focused on finding the seed of abolition in these early Quaker records. And I decided that we needed to ask different questions. So instead of reading abolition back in time, I thought it was important to understand how slave-owning Quakers, as well as other slave-owning Christians, fit into their own time. None of them would have predicted the demise of slavery or the slave trade. So if I really wanted to understand them and the relationship between Christianity and slavery more broadly during this period, then I needed to take a different approach. At that point, I also decided to expand the scope of my research beyond Quakers to include other Christian denominations. So I chose to focus on the Church of England, the Anglicans, and the Moravian Church, which is a small Protestant denomination headquartered in Eastern Germany. And these three Protestant denominations, it turns out, they were the first Protestant denominations to send missionaries to specifically try to convert enslaved people to Christianity. And as a result, they discussed the relationship between Christianity and slavery in greater depth. So to get back to sort of this big question, why did these Christians accept slavery in this period? How did they justify slavery using theology? And I also wanted to think about what Christianity might have meant to enslaved and free Black men and women who became Christian. When and why did they choose to convert? These became the questions that fueled my research. And I started by taking a closer look at Barbados. So Barbados was the most important English colony in the 17th century. Not Massachusetts, not Pennsylvania, it's Barbados, was far more important. It was settled in 1627, and colonists soon began to plant tobacco and then sugar. While the English colonists initially relied on a joint labor force of European indentured servants and enslaved Africans, by the 1650s, enslaved Africans had become the majority of the labor force. And Quakerism started to flourish around the same time. Two Quaker missionaries, Anne Fisher and Mary Austin, landed on the island in 1655 and successfully converted or convinced, in Quaker parlance, several island residents. 2 decades later, there were thousands of Quakers living on Barbados, all but 4 of whom were slave owners. And actually, this map that I am showing you right here was created by a Quaker, Richard Ford. And when he created it in 1675, I think that was, we know that the governor of Barbados was very peeved because he refused to depict any of the military force that they had for their defense because they had an anti-war testimony. But he was apparently the only surveyor that could be gotten on the island. So we have letters from the governor complaining about the lack of depiction of these force, but he assured the people in London that there were defenses. So by the 1670s, the Quaker founder, George Fox, decided to visit the Quaker communities in the colonies, and Barbados was his first stop. There, he became deeply concerned about the practice of slavery, but really not for the reasons that we might hope. So he did urge Quakers to consider manumission, but he didn't call for an end to slavery as a practice. But he did do something else, which is that he urged friends to worship with the enslaved people in their households and to introduce them to Quakerism. So I think in many ways this is disappointing. And in fact, much of the scholarship about Fox's visit to Barbados is a debate about whether his remarks can be considered proto-anti-slavery or not. But again, I think when we focus on anti-slavery, we miss a really important point. And that important point has to do with the reaction of other colonists on Barbados. So in 1675, a few years after Fox's visit, English colonists discovered that a group of enslaved men were planning a rebellion. In response, the English colonists took drastic measures. They executed the enslaved rebels, they tortured others, and they rewarded informants. They also did something rather unusual. They passed an act that forbid Quakers from worshiping alongside enslaved men and women. So I'll read a passage from the act here. This act asserted that enslaved people had, quote, been suffered to remain at the meeting of Quakers as hearers of their doctrine and taught in their principles, whereby the safety of this island may be hazarded. If the act continued, any enslaved person was, quote, found with the said people called Quakers at any time of their meeting and as hearers of their preaching, those Quakers would have to pay a fine. Within a year, the Quaker Ralph Fretwell was, quote, prosecuted for 80 enslaved people being present at a meeting in his house, and Richard Sutton was taken to court for 30 enslaved people being present at a meeting. So what is going on here? Why would Quakers be blamed for a slave rebellion when, as I was mentioning before, they have a peace testimony and won't even draw a fort on a map? So I've learned in doing historical research that when something doesn't really make sense, you have to dig in. And it's often these incongruencies that reveal something fundamentally important about a particular place and time. So 17th century Quakers, I came to understand, were radical, but not because they were abolitionists. Instead, Quakers like George Fox were radical because they suggested that Blacks and whites should meet together for worship. Nor were the Quakers the only Christians persecuted for meeting together with enslaved people. As I began to investigate this issue further and read through the Anglican and Moravian archives, I realized that there were some very important similarities in their experiences. So in each case, Protestant slave owners attacked missionaries and enslaved Christians for meeting together. On the island of St. Thomas, for example, Moravian missionaries and Black converts were beaten and attacked by white colonists. Slave owners stole Bibles from enslaved Christians, and they burned Moravian books. So this is a letter that was either written or more likely dictated by a free Black Moravian woman named Marata, who wrote to the Queen of Denmark to ask her to support Black Christians. And so she's writing to the Queen of Denmark because St. Thomas at this point is a Danish colony. So in this letter, she asks the Queen to support the Black women of St. Thomas because slave owners would not allow them to, quote, serve the Lord Jesus. So this petition was written first in Marata's native West African language, which is on the left, and then translated into Dutch Creole. And her appeal was accompanied by another letter written in Dutch Creole and also signed by several other Black Moravians on St. Thomas. This letter went into more detail about the problems facing enslaved Christians. The white planters, they wrote, quote, beat and injure us when we learn about the Savior, they wrote. They burn our books, call our baptism the baptism of dogs, and call the brethren, the Moravian missionaries, beasts. As I looked closer at these and other sources, I began to understand why English slave owners found the prospect of slave conversion so threatening. First, when enslaved people became Christian, it challenged the justification for slavery, which was religious difference. And here, of course, it's really important to note that there is no concept of race as we understand it today. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later on. Second, in some cases, missionaries taught enslaved people to read the Bible and to write. And this was unsurprisingly very unpopular among slave owners. And this was increasingly true as enslavers tried to limit the ability of enslaved people to move from plantation to plantation, and they created the ticket system based on written notes. And third, when enslaved Christians would meet for worship, white colonists feared that they were plotting slave rebellion. This is exactly what happened in Barbados. When Quakers started to include enslaved people in their worship meetings, English slave owners reacted aggressively. So when the Quaker William Edmondson visited Barbados in 1675, for example, he was attacked by the governor for, quote, making the Negroes Christians and making them rebel and cut their throats. I want to pause again here because these documents reveal what I think are some misunderstood aspects of colonial slavery. What this history shows us is that English slave owners thought of Christianity, and especially Protestantism, as a religion for free people. And they worried that a baptized slave would demand freedom and possibly rebel. As a result, they excluded most enslaved people from Protestant churches. I felt that this was an extremely important aspect of early colonial slavery that was very different from antebellum slavery, and that it had not been sort of fully digested in the scholarship. Certainly there's been writing on it, but I don't think the ramifications have been emphasized enough. It's also really different from the role that Catholicism played in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, where enslaved people were baptized as part of the process of enslavement. And I'd be happy to sort of delve more into those differences in the Q&A. So in my book, I gave this sort of pattern that I saw a name. I called it Protestant supremacy. So what do I mean by Protestant supremacy? Protestant supremacy, I came to understand, was the forerunner of white supremacy. White supremacy uses race to create inequality, but in the 17th century, as we were talking about before, race as we know it did not exist. And most significantly, the concept of whiteness had not really been fully created. So slave owners created this ideology of Protestant slave supremacy, which used religion to justify slavery. And I turned to legal archives to understand this better. I read through all of the laws passed in the island of Barbados in the 17th and early 18th centuries. And in the earliest slave laws, I found colonists didn't call themselves white. Instead, they called themselves Christians. Protestant slave owners constructed a caste system based on Christian status, in which heathen slaves were afforded basically no rights or privileges, while Catholics, Jews, and non-conforming Protestants were viewed with sort of varying levels of suspicion and distrust, but granted more protections. This is why it was so controversial for Quakers and other missionaries to introduce enslaved people to Christianity, because it threatened to undermine Protestant supremacy. So the next question, of course, is how did this change? How did Protestant supremacy become white supremacy? We've already seen how Protestant supremacy was challenged. So it was challenged by missionaries, including the Quakers, and it was also challenged by enslaved and free Blacks who wanted to become Christian, so people like Maratta. But in each case, it was challenged in a different way. And I'll start with the missionaries. What I found is that Quaker, Anglican, and Moravian missionaries responded to Protestant supremacy by trying to argue that Christianity and slavery were perfectly compatible. Protestant missionaries drew on biblical descriptions of slavery, as well as the ideal of the godly household, in order to encourage slave owners to allow enslaved people to convert. They noted that Christian slavery had a long and well-established history in not only Europe, but also the Catholic American colonies. And missionaries also tried to defend slave conversion by arguing that enslaved Christians would be more docile and harder working than their quote unquote heathen counterparts. For an example of this, we can return to the Quaker William Edmondson, who's often thought of as one of the first anti-slavery Quakers. But when he was attacked by the governor of Barbados for worshiping alongside enslaved people, he responded by saying, quote, "It was a good work to bring them to the knowledge of God and Christ Jesus, and that would keep them from rebelling or cutting any man's throat." The implications are here are clear. Conversion would make slavery safer. It would make enslaved people less rebellious. Enslaved Christians fought Protestant supremacy in a different way. As we saw in Maratta's letter, they tended to argue that they had a right to practice Christianity, to read the Bible, and to worship together. And over time, more and more enslaved and free people of color fought their way into Christian churches. And they did so for numerous and complicated reasons. There's no sort of easy answer here because there are so many, each individual has their own story, but there are theological, practical, and social motivations that brought people into churches. One of these individuals was named Charles Cuffey. Cuffey, who was probably born into slavery, was baptized on September 9th, 1677 in an Anglican church in Barbados. The minister noted that Cuffey had recently been freed, which made him the first free Black man to be baptized on the islands. In 1689, 12 years after his baptism, Cuffey brought two children to the baptismal font, Thomas, who was 10, and Mary, who was 5. The minister again noted that they were the son and daughter of Charles Cuffey, free Christian Negro. By joining the Anglican Church, Cuffey was making a claim for himself. As a free Christian man, he had acquired most of the markings of a freeholder. And according to Barbadian law at the time, he'd be eligible to vote in elections and hypothetically run for office if he could acquire enough property. And it was in response to free Black Christians like Charles Cuffey that English Quakers began to create white supremacy. Soon after Cuffey brought his children to the baptismal fonts, Barbadian lawmakers wrote a new law redefining a freeholder status to include the word white as well as Christian. And this was one of the very first times that the word white was used in the Barbadian legal records. The law declared that, quote, "Every white man professing the Christian religion who hath attained to the full age of 21 year and hath 10 acres of freehold shall be deemed a freeholder." 12 years later, lawmakers refined their definition of whiteness further. A 1709 law clarified that a white person could have, quote, "no extract from a Negro," thereby establishing a one-drop rule as the definition of whiteness and laying a new foundation for slavery and social oppression that made race seem like a natural category, something that was innate. What we see here is the codification of whiteness as a legal category that was specifically intended to exclude free Black Christians from the full rights of citizenship. And we often take whiteness as a given, but it really has this specific history. And it's more than sort of a social construct. I would call this a political category. As we can see here, slave-owning politicians actively created this category of whiteness as part of a political strategy to protect slave ownership and to restrict the voting rights of free Blacks. With the creation of whiteness, slave conversion became less threatening. Whiteness, rather than religious difference, became the new way to justify and enforce slavery. So what are we to do with this history? I want to make a few concluding remarks to bring this history back to the present. And first of all, I'll say that when we as a society are increasingly aware of the lasting effects of white supremacy, it's important to think about where whiteness comes from. Certainly it's not biological. This is a very destructive belief. It naturalizes race and allows us to forget that whiteness was created specifically in order to legalize and justify inequality. In other words, we need to acknowledge that individuals made decisions that led to Protestant supremacy and to white supremacy. This was no unthinking history. And if we don't recognize it, then I think we're constantly at risk of repeating these injuries of the past. Second, I think it's important to think about the many different meanings that religion had in slave societies. So we see in Protestant supremacy, religion is being used as a source of oppression, a justification for oppression. But that's certainly not what it meant to the enslaved men and women who fought really hard to be baptized. And I think our histories need to keep these two in balance, and especially not allow this sort of oppressive regime of Protestant supremacy to cloud our ability to be sensitive to the experiences of enslaved and free Black Christians. And I think this history also invites us to think about what it really means to combat oppression. I think it shows that it's not enough to be just radical, right? Quakers like George Fox were radical, but they still accommodated their theology to slavery. We also have to be sort of vigilantly aware of history, of the complexities of inequality as we craft solutions to current forms of injustice. And finally, I'll say that, of course, we all know history is never inevitable. Things could have developed differently. As we know, Quakers, as well as many evangelical Christians, both Black and white, played a central role in the abolitionist movement, showing how Christianity could be used to support emancipation. We can and should remember those abolitionist Quakers and learn from them, but we can't whitewash our own history or we risk repeating it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katharine. And now I think the floor is open for questions. The way we're going to handle questions is you should put questions in the chat, and then I will relay them to Katharine. I get to ask the first question since I'm the moderator. Can you talk a little bit about the book cover?
Oh, I would love to. The book cover is a painting by the Moravian oil painter Johann Valentin Haidt, or Haidt, H-A-I-D-T. And it is called the Erstlingsbild, or the First Fruits. And it was a painting that was done, in order to celebrate basically the Moravian Church becoming what the Moravians felt was a global church. And so, for those who know a little bit about Moravian history, they were exiled from from Saxony in Germany. And one of the reactions to this was they sort of wanted to travel the whole world and have people from all nations, right? And this is very biblical, come into the Moravian fold. And so the painting, which was done in 1747, about 15 years after they sort of started this effort to become a global church, they showed the specific individuals who had converted to the Moravian Church from all over the world. So I have the people who are in the front. I don't know if we can see have that image come up again, Clayton. But there are people who I write about in the book who are on the book cover. Um, so that's George Fox. There we go. Yes. So this is the two little boys. Are one of them is named Oli Carmel. He's one of the uh, first first people of African descent who's baptized in the Moravian Church, and he travels back to Germany actually, and then dies in Germany. And when the Moravians begin a mission station in Jamaica, they name their mission station Carmel after him. So I mean, I could talk forever about this cover. I won't, but I will say that everyone is sort of a specific person with their own history who joins the Moravian Church. And then I should also note they had died by the time this painting was created in 1747, because they're all here pictured with Jesus. Rebecca Proughton, I just saw this come up. Rebecca Proughton is not one of them because she was still alive. She's super white, yes.
So did the painter know about these stories from oral histories? How were these stories of these people kept alive?
So the stories of these individuals, some of them he probably met because a number of them did travel back to Germany. So a lot of the Moravian converts who were of African descent, especially sort of the people who are the helpers, which is their word for the leaders in their church, they traveled to the Moravian headquarters. Many of them went to Pennsylvania. There's the Moravian headquarters in Bethlehem, and then some went to Herrnhut. And I think that Johann Haidt was in Herrnhut. I would have to double check about that. But if he was there, then that would have meant he would have met several people. Mm-hmm. And the other way that you would find out about them would be through Moravians recorded in many cases, not all cases, recorded Lebensläufe, like sort of the life stories of people. And so we have them for some of these individuals, and then they would also have known about them because Moravians circulated journals throughout the Atlantic world, telling stories about different people, and as well as sort of stories of what they were doing in their congregations. And so through those missionary and sort of church documents, then they would be read at worship services all over sort of the Atlantic world, and they would have heard about these people.
Thank you. Reville and Prell would like you to discuss the differences in your research and what you've shown in your research, and Spanish and Portuguese justifications of slavery and their relationship to Christianity.
Yeah, this was one of the big questions for me, is because I knew when I went into this research, Christianity and slavery were perfectly compatible if you look sort of historically. And not only that, when the English and other Protestant denominations are actually venturing, planting colonies and venturing into the Atlantic world and becoming more engaged in transatlantic slavery, the precedent of Spanish and Portuguese slavery shows that Catholicism is a central part. And so here, this goes back into the 15th century when the Portuguese were first sort of creating trade posts and trading with people, Kingdom of Congo and other locations on the coast of West Central Africa and West Africa. And the rulers of, the Iberian kingdoms sought confirmation from the Pope that they were allowed to do this. And so you have a series of papal bulls that sort of that tie Catholicism and enslavement together in a particular way, in which in part of the process of enslaving somebody meant that they were supposed to be baptized. And this was part of the way that these empires undergirded their slave law. And so enslaved people then were subjects, right? They were vassals. And so it's a very different legal history that has been there has been a lot written about sort of how much you can say about sort of the legal differences between Spanish and Portuguese slavery as compared to sort of Protestants like British, Dutch, or Danish slavery. But I think that for the purposes of this story, it is really important and consequential that there is this difference in where baptism can happen. And, you know, I can also talk about why I think, you know, English and Dutch slave owners were so hesitant and fearful of allowing enslaved people to become baptized. But that also ties into, you know, history of Protestant Reformation. There are so many things, but also weak nationalist churches, decentralized states, and the power, especially, you know, if you look at colonial British America, enslavers have a lot more power to create their own laws, and they just don't want enslaved people to be baptized or gain access to any rights. And that is sort of counteracted in some ways in the Iberian colonies, where there's a much stronger sort of absolutist monarch and who controls both the church and the state because of the Patronato Real and the Padroado Real. I don't know if that's sort of I threw a lot of answers at you, Helen. I don't know if you have a follow-up or if that makes sense.
Ravellen, do you have a follow-up? Okay, maybe I get.
I'm great, thank you.
Okay, okay. So the next question is, the questioner can't help but notice, but everybody in your story that you've mentioned is male, the former slave governors, and but the abolitionists are a mixed gender group of male and female. And so the question is, how do you see gender functioning in your story?
Yeah, great question. It's true. A lot of the records that I read are written by men. You know, this is we all know this is one of the struggles of doing history. But I think that, yeah, gender is absolutely important. You know, I didn't go into sort of the nitty gritty of the construction of race and gender, but obviously part of the story that I was telling was a very male story, right? That because men are I talked about Charles Cuffy, who becoming free and becoming Christian meant that he was sort of close to accessing certain rights that were not available to women. And the story of bringing women and gender into this is absolutely fundamental. I mean, here, you know, drawing on Jennifer Morgan's work on laboring women. And I think it comes out more when you look at the specific history of the creation of race and whiteness in Virginia as compared to what I was looking at in Barbados. There you have, there's a woman, Elizabeth Key, who is a mixed race woman who sues to become free. She actually, because she is Christian, among other things, and there she is granted that. But of course, in Virginia, around the same time, we also have the first law saying that anyone who's born from a enslaved woman would inherit the status of the mother, right? So there you have gender being absolutely fundamental to specifically the construction of how slavery is passed down. And so it's sort of talking about Blackness more than whiteness. And whiteness, you know, it's interesting just sort of as I answer this question, realizing that the history of whiteness that I've told is a more masculine story. That in itself is kind of interesting. But yeah, gender also, I'll say, is really important when looking at the missionary records. So women were almost always sort of the most important players in sort of the conversion experience. You know, and there's a lot of research on the role of women in congregations, regardless of sort of time and place and race. But you can also see that in my records that sort of, especially as these Protestant denominations become more popular among enslaved and free Black communities, that women are playing a central role in that story. And so, someone mentioned Rebecca Proughton before, and this is a really good example of that. Rebecca Proughton was a Moravian woman who was formerly enslaved, and then, had become free by the time she became a Moravian. But she really did a lot of the legwork in making the Moravian Church very successful in St. Thomas. So that's another aspect of the gender story that is crucial to this.
Thank you. Kent says, has a question. The transition in legal language from Christian to white is fascinating. Did similar transitions occur in other colonies too, or is this a story that's in particular about Barbados?
Yes, it is a trend, I would say. I was kind of alluding to this before when I was talking about Virginia, but if you look at legal records in the in English colonies in the 17th century, and you read them all, you'll see this transition in all of them, from Christian to white. But there are very specific and local histories that contribute to that progression in each place. So like I was saying, in Virginia, it's fueled by different concerns and different sort of specific people. So Elizabeth Key is one that I mentioned before, and sort of gender here plays a different kind of role. In Barbados, the way that it is, whiteness enters the legal archive is so much about sort of, especially the growing free Black community, and trying to sort of keep them separate from the, not just, the white Protestants, but all other whites. There's a large Jewish population on Barbados, so trying to sort of maintain a hierarchy. And so this is why, we have a particular sort of way that whiteness develops in Barbados that's different from other colonies, but it absolutely is happening in other places. There's another sort of study of Pennsylvania where also sort of disputes with Native peoples also play a really important role in the way that whiteness is created. So it's a complex trajectory no matter where you are, but you can also see an overall trends that tracks throughout the colonies.
Thank you. The next question is from Mark, and it's a big one. The question is, what distinctions, if any, were made between slavery practiced in biblical times and in the 17th century? And I guess the question is, are they fundamentally different institutions, or can you see commonalities? And is the fact that slavery is a biblical practice somehow used as a justification?
Well, it's definitely used as a justification. That's 100%. What distinctions? They were very different. I mean, slavery is an evolving practice. And so the way that, it's practiced, even between Barbados and Brazil, right? Like there are similarities, but there are a lot of differences. I would say I'm not an expert on, slavery in biblical times, but the type of sort of plantation, especially what developed in Barbados with sort of the cultivation of first tobacco plantations and then sugar plantations, that's a very different sort of type of slavery than what you would see even sort of in Europe at the same time in the Mediterranean world. There are, again, we can return to gender, like different sort of emphases on gender roles. There are different, the demographics make a big difference as sort of the enslaved population becomes larger than the free population. That has implications for sort of the type of laws that are passed. So really, there's frankly probably more that's different than the same.
Okay, thank you. So here's, I think this is a question from Ed Tebenhoff. At least as far back as Tim Green and Stephen Ennis in the 1970s, historians have talked about Black people participating in marriage, baptism, and godparentage as a way of claiming institutional inclusion in society. Societies and free Blacks were welcomed in the Dutch Reformed Church in places like New Amsterdam from the earliest period until the 1650s, when ministers changed and slaves were increasingly excluded and the emphasis moved from Christian to white. But there was active Black participation in the Reformed Church until at least 1710s and 20s. What might have motivated these later generations?
Well, that's a really great and informed question. Yeah, it's true. I look a little bit at the Dutch Reformed Church and their history with slavery in the 17th century in the first chapter of my book. And yeah, New Amsterdam is an interesting place because, and there's some new research about this by Patricia Bonamy, that yeah, there was sort of a reverse trend, right? There was initially more inclusion, and then there's sort of a shift to more exclusion in this at this time. I mean, but why? And I think that the point that this question makes about the fact that this was claiming institutional inclusion is a really important one, because I think that it's a motivating factor, and I think that continues to be a motivating factor. So that is, in a way, an answer to the question, why was there active Black participation until the 1710s, 20s? Right, because I think people are sort of holding on to what institutional affiliation and can mean for them. And if you follow through sort of the history of Black Christianity and look at the the decision starting in the late 18th century of Black Christians to separate from white churches because the white churches are too racist. Again, you see this effort to incorporate churches and to call upon, and there's really wonderful research by Sally Gordon on this, like the incorporation of Black churches and the ways in which that calling upon, laws about incorporation were used by Black Christians to try to protect Black communities. And so there again, I think you see this, right? It's this tension and this play back and forth between Black Christians who are trying to make, get access to rights and institutional security, and then efforts on the part of many white people to sort of exclude them from those rights. And that's, yeah, there you go.
All right, well, Anne just texted me that she got kicked off. So this is why we have backups in place.
Anne's back.
Oh, good, you're back. Never mind.
No, yeah, this is why we have backup and text. I'd like to thank Katharine, and I'd like to thank everybody who came. I think this is really a great example of the way that we are a community that extends beyond our geographical boundaries. And it's exciting to talk about books. I think a book published in 2018 still counts as a new book. It's really wonderful to share research. It's wonderful to share research that that has such presentist values, that really looks at the question of how do we think about justice. I guess many of you know this, but you may not all know this. Within the last week or so, Katharine was named Scholar of the College by CLA, which is a really great honor. And I think you can hear by listening to her talk why this might be the case. And I guess the last thing that I will say is, if any of you are moved to contribute to the history department, I believe there will be instructions on how to do that in a follow-up email that Clayton will send, and he's just put information on the chat. These are hard times for everybody. I think one of the categories of people that these are particularly hard times for is graduate students. And so I don't normally ask for money, but I think that we would welcome contributions if you are so moved.